Thanks, everybody. Welcome to our Trade Justice Alliance Sunday night webinar. Tonight's topic is NAFTA 2.0 Ask the Experts. Our special guest speakers are Michael Stumo. He is the CEO of Coalition for a Prosperous America. Celeste Drake, Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist with the AFL-CIO. And William Waren, Senior Trade Analyst, Friends of the Earth. I just want to say a few words about events that happened last week in Charlottesville. For many of us in the trade justice movement, it has always been about human rights and equality. It's really the reason I got involved in this. And attacks on people and bigotry are a primary reason many of us are in the movement. We're greatly saddened by the escalation of neo-Nazi and white supremacist movements in this country, and also violence and hate. And we wanted to express our sorrow over the death of activist Heather Heyer and the injury of many others that were standing against hate in Charlottesville last weekend. It really has been a jarring, surreal week for many of us, and also it's my understanding that there were many clergy and people of faith that were out on the front lines, and they actually put their lives on the line in Charlottesville. So we want to recognize those people. And I also wanted to say that, for myself, this really made me think very clearly that we all need to stand in solidarity even more to make this world a better place, which is why we got involved in this campaign. So tonight we will be hearing from these three trade experts on their positions on the current NAFTA negotiations and objectives, and the possibility even of a position related to the replacement of NAFTA or a withdrawal. So tonight, I'm not going to really go into very much on the intro, except to say that if you are in phone only and you want to open the meeting room on your computer, you can go to tradejustice.net/room. And I wanted to also mention that the meeting room is courtesy of Andrea Miller, Executive Director of PeopleDemandingAction.org. You can visit our Facebook group also at facebook.com/groups Trade Justice Alliance, and our website is tradejustice.net. Now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Michael Stumo. He is the Chief Executive Officer of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. CPA is a coalition of agriculture, manufacturing, and organized labor associations, companies, and individuals. CPA works for policies to balance U.S. trade, maintain U.S. sovereignty, and also to develop an effective national production and economic strategy. Michael has a Bachelor of Science from Iowa State University in Agriculture, a law degree from the University of Iowa, graduating from both institutions with high distinction. He is a member of the bars of Massachusetts, Nebraska, and Connecticut, and he is the author of law review articles and the editor of a policy book entitled A Food and Agricultural Policy for the 21st Century. Welcome, Michael Stumo.
Thank you, Harriet. Pleasure to be here. And also want to, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound great.
Yeah. So, also wanted to mention that Teamsters Union, I think Mike Dolan might be on, or he was going to be on. They're a member of ours and in our coalition.
Great.
Stan Sorcher and SPIA, as well as the AFL-CIO Industrial Union Council. We focus on the trade deficit, balance of trade, and the job issues primarily. And so if you want to go to the next slide, I just wanted to talk about how we think about recently trade in three levels, and it's relevant to the debate when people say, oh, you need a trade agreement to increase trade, or we're going to decrease trade, or we're going to be putting barriers around the country, that sort of thing. It's largely irrelevant, those comments, to and how Ways and Means talks about it, to how trade really works. If you think, one way to think about it is in three levels. the total volume of global trade is irrelevant really to trade agreements. It's just caused by growth in global economies. If you have a recession, global trade shrinks. If you have expansion, global trade expands. So, stopping or starting trade with trade agreements is usually is just not the way to think about it. The balance or imbalance of trade, in other words, persistent deficits and surpluses, is primarily, but not exclusively, primarily a function of exchange rate misalignment, currencies. We in the trade movement aren't necessarily used to thinking of it this way, but at least in the last year, we've become pretty convinced that, and Rob Scott has too, that it's largely an exchange rate misalignment issue, which I'll show you a couple things on shortly. And the last is the composition of trade. What are you trading? Are you trading, are you selling a lot of, oil or natural gas, or selling a lot of advanced manufacturing products or auto parts, and what are you buying? The composition of trade is more, what do you produce? What do you subsidize? What's your industrial policy? What are you good at? The trade agreements, the trade enforcement. And a good way to think about this is something called Dutch disease, whereby in the past the Dutch discovered oil. They were then exporting a bunch of oil, which made their currency rise, which made their manufacturing and agriculture goods less competitive. So their balance of trade and quantity of trade was the same, but it just happened to be dominated more by oil and less by manufacturing and agriculture. So, that's kind of a hierarchical way of thinking about it. And as you think deeper about it, you realize a lot of what Kevin Brady says and Dave Reichert, doesn't make any sense. If we go to the next, this slide that you're on, surplus countries. The big challenge we have right now in our view at CPA is that we have some persistent surplus countries like China, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. They overproduce, they underconsume, and they're exporting their overproduction of goods and their unemployment to deficit countries like us. So they excessively rely on deficit country consumers like the U.S. for growth, whereas we as a deficit country and some others, we import the other countries' excess. Our people don't work so much because our consumer demand isn't even being taken up by U.S. Buying U.S. production. On net, we're buying more foreign production, and so we have devalued labor, capital, and services. We have underutilized labor and plant capacity and the like. So we think that's the big challenge, is the persistent surpluses and deficits. And if you go to the next slide, you can see the surplus countries, which have the blue lines on the right. They're the ones that are overproducing, underconsuming, and relying on the U.S. and other countries for consumers for growth, and we're a deficit country, as well as the UK and some others. And if we go to the next slide, you see that for the U.S. deficit in 2016, China's the big issue. Mexico's number 4. Japan and Germany are 2 and 3. So we tend at CPA to focus a lot on China. It's very hard to fix the U.S. economy and the trade deficit and our jobs problem without dealing with China. Mexico is the number 4, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but mostly because of low wage rates. But China's the big issue for us, and Japan and Germany are 2 and 3. So the next slide, please. So getting to NAFTA, Lighthizer gave a talk, Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, who's sort of a economic nationalist or a Hamiltonian. I call him a Hamiltonian because Alexander Hamilton, back in the day, in George Washington's days, put together the first national strategy in production. He wasn't a free trader. He was all about producing more and getting jobs in the U.S. rather than importing cheap goods from Europe. So Lighthizer was very different, as those of you who took a look in terms of what he laid out as opposed to Mexican and Canadian trade negotiators. So these were the points that he made in his talk, which are his particular objectives. They aren't necessarily Congress's objectives, but ones he laid out. and reducing the trade deficit, strengthening rules of origin, strengthening labor provisions in a way that I don't know if they even know. I don't know if it, we'll see how that comes out, whether it's labor standards or going so far as wage rates, which is really the big issue, is wage rates. Effective provisions against currency manipulation. We've always been pretty strong on currency manipulation here at CPA, but now the big issue, direct manipulation is largely ebbed, but misalignment, currencies are misaligned. The dollar is way overvalued and other countries are undervalued that are surplus countries. Actually, we have a webinar on this on Wednesday, and we're urging the administration to go beyond manipulation and deal with misalignment, where currencies are over or undervalued regardless of manipulation. His comment on ISDS was that it should respect sovereignty and the democratic process. He didn't say it shouldn't be there. He said ISDS shouldn't be there. He said it should respect those points. Guard against third-party market distorting practices, third country, China, Vietnam, and others who are shipping through the NAFTA countries and distorting markets, as well as state-owned enterprises, primarily in third countries, because Canada and Mexico don't have strong SOE sectors. And then last is equal access in government procurement and agriculture. I don't know what equal access in agriculture necessarily means, but our view in government procurement is that government procurement shouldn't even be in any trade agreements. We should just buy American with taxpayer dollars because we have the big government procurement market. Everyone else has smaller ones and they don't really let us in anyway, even though they promise it. Might as well just buy American here and let them buy domestic in their countries. So that's what he said. It's not everything that the fair traders want, but it's different than we've seen before from Froman, et cetera. Now, the rest of the players in the D.C. swamp have not necessarily changed. Kevin Brady tries to frame it as a modernization and upgrading of NAFTA to lower barriers and include digital commerce, standard free trader stuff. Ditto with Dave Reichert. We want to modernize it. The multinationals say they don't want to disrupt supply chains or hurt consumers. The big ag lobby's points are to harmonize regulations, facilitate more cross-border trade and integration. And then within the administration, we have the free trade Goldman Sachs globalists, from Gary Cohn at the National Economic Council to the State Department, who looks at trade deals as an extension of foreign policy, where we give up parts of our economy in return for countries being our friends. Treasury, and then the staff economists. I put the staff economists in because I know that even in Department of Commerce, if one of my contacts there said, you go talk to our staff economists, our career bureaucrats, and you talk about, well, if we do a tariff on this or do this on currency, to correct things, and they say, no, you can't do that. You'll hurt consumers. You'll disrupt the economy. You'll crash the economy. You can't do that. So there's something to the sort of right-wing deep state allegation there because the staff economists aren't with us. So Mexico is not a currency manipulator, and they're not misaligned. They're not an undervalued currency. Mexico actually has a trade deficit with the world, but they have a big surplus with us. It's mostly because the U.S. has a very overvalued dollar. That's why Mexico has a surplus with us, but not with other countries. Even China has a massive surplus with us, but they have a deficit with Japan, Korea, and Germany. And again, it's because of our overvalued dollar largely. But low wage rates are the big issue why the deficit drivers in the Mexico-U.S. trade exist, such as auto parts, electronics, machinery, and equipment, and then in beef, fruits, and vegetables among the ag sector. Since NAFTA, many of you have heard all the lost jobs, and you would expect when you sort of partially merge our labor markets that the U.S. wages would go down, and they certainly have, especially auto parts. Real wage devaluation in the auto sector has been 27%. It's been the worst of all sectors. It's been horrible. but wages in Mexico didn't rise. They are rising in China, but not in Mexico, so it isn't even like the Mexican worker benefited. The Canada-U.S. trade is roughly in balance. There's going to be some sectoral issues from dairy to lumber and the like. We're not paying a lot of attention to that. Next slide, please. So these are the three sets of players that the way I see it is the economic nationalists, like I mentioned, the Hamiltonians, which are focused on the economics, the U.S. jobs, manufacturing, and growth. They are pro-strategy to grow, U.S. employment and U.S. supply chains. Then you have the standard globalists, which we've been fighting forever, Kilmer or Brady or Reichert and the like. And then the fair traders, which I'll, overly characterize maybe, but, good jobs, environment, social justice for citizens in the U.S. and globally. We see an alliance, the best alliance right now to the extent it can be between the economic nationalists and the fair traders against the globalists. Next slide. So before I speak on this slide fully, I'm just going to say that I did talk to folks in USTR. They are paying attention to, the ISDS issues or the jobs issues and some of the more, some of the fair trade issues. They're listening to Dem demands. Whether they give in to any Dem demands depends on whether they think the Dems are pump faking. This is just a real politics sense in that, okay, so we'll put in something the Dems want or the Dem non-globalists want, but then they may vote against it anyway and we'll lose Republicans and we won't get a vote. Interestingly, they said, if we just tweak NAFTA, the votes exist in Congress to pass a tweaked NAFTA because the Congress is still free trade dominated. A massive change in NAFTA, it's unclear where the votes will come from. Right now, Lighthizer's preference is to have a big change. What that means, we'll see, and what can he get, we'll see if he can get anything of significance. CPA has been pushing the line that they should not be afraid to end NAFTA, probably pushing it stronger than anyone else that I've seen anyway. And as a takeaway in this call, I would ask you to consider to the degree or the extent to which you would be comfortable saying, why don't we just end the thing? And on a substantive level, I wonder if trade deals are inherently anti-democratic. They're inherently multinational corporate grab bags that just shouldn't exist. They're too far from the citizenry that they will be dominated by the corporatists always. Maybe it's better just to rely on national law. The citizens have more direct participation. They have a stronger position in the democratic system. And if one agrees with that, you could put it into a principle saying that, well, if national law can handle an issue like food safety, product safety, an environmental issue, et cetera, why globalize it? So that's my takeaway is, you might want to consider to the extent, well, maybe be a little stronger. Let's just end NAFTA and rely on national law, and maybe the trade agreement, modern trade agreement era should end itself. So that's my report.
That sounds, I could live with that, actually. So what we're going to do now is we're going to be opening up the lines for questions. If you have a question for Michael Stumo, please press *6 on your phone. I have a question in the meantime while we're getting people on the line. Michael, I was just wondering, how concerned are you about the nationalist attitude right now towards Trump, especially with all the events that have just happened recently? You think Trump's original nationalist stance is going to be working against people, like the fair traders and having a good deal with NAFTA?
Yeah, so I view nationalism as coming in many flavors: chocolate, strawberry, vanilla, and caramel. And the ethno-nationalists, which are, what we saw in Charlotte, are freaks, of course. The economic nationalists, someone like a Lighthizer or a Wilbur Ross, are different from the ethno-nationalists and dislike them, even though, the media has labeled nationalism all as one, or nationalism and populism. I mean, I grew up, I thought I was a populist, and all of a sudden, all the Trump supporters are populists. So I said, well, that wasn't what I thought of populism. So I would distinguish economic nationalism from ethno-nationalism, and I think the fair traders have more common cause with the economic nationalists, even though they don't with the ethno-nationalists.
Okay, thank you. Carrie, are you able to work the lines here?
Yes, we do have a couple people in the queue now.
Great. All right. Well, we've got about 5 or 7 minutes for questions, everybody. So let's get going.
Okay, our first caller is at area code 212. Your line is open.
Thank you. I'm very new at this, and my questions are simple, but it's terrific I get to ask them. I'm not sure. I noticed on the slide that wage rates between the American and Mexican workers seem to be the driver for U.S. trade deficits. Well, how could anyone change the wage rates that are causing this? We can't change Mexico's wage rates, could we?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a tough question. How do you affect wage rates in a trade agreement? And I know Celeste Drake and the AFL-CIO have thought a lot about that. They put, some pretty strong, requests in their NAFTA testimony and thought about those wage rates. So it's a tough issue, but I think I'm going to defer to Celeste later.
Thank you.
Okay, our next question comes from a caller at area code 304. Your line is open.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stumo. A quick question. I have been calling the Senate, and I'm wondering, we have the Citizens Trade Organization must have many thousands of members. There are over 30 organizations and 11 different unions with membership, and I don't see why we can't generate 50,000 calls to them to ask them to stand up for their country. I just, in my calls to the Senate, the aides have been very nice and taken my 3 points, and so I'm wondering, should we do more?
Sure, 100,000 calls are great, 150 are great. You want to target them in the right places. I mean, well, the volume is good. On this point of, sort of the right-wing economic nationalists, we worked with them as CPA on kind of a quiet basis back during the Fast Track Trade Authority vote, because we didn't have enough calls, as I suspect you may not, in the more conservative districts in the South, in the places where Republicans are strong and they're not challenged by Democrats and don't have to listen to the liberal side. So we didn't think we could win the Fast Track Trade Authority without somehow aligning with the Tea Party, though quietly and not terribly publicly at the time. And I think the case is now we've got to find a way to, re-up common cause with the right sort of patriot nationalist folks that you can work with to get those calls in, because they think they don't want to be selling out to, China, or instead of the multinationals, they think of the crony capitalists. So what districts you call in matters too.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, our next Oh, our next caller is Susan. Your line is open.
Yes, I attended a town hall with Representative Tom Cole this last week, and I asked him about the ISDS chapter in the NAFTA renegotiation, and although I couldn't get a commitment from him to not agree to having that in there, what is the best way to push someone who happens to be a Native American Chickasaw? He's an enrolled member of the Chickasaw tribe. How can I push him to not agree to a trade deal that gives up not just national sovereignty but tribal sovereignty too?
Right. I think the best way is to, for someone like Tom Cole, for example, there was you got to play into or utilize arguments that already are agreed to on the right. For example, the sovereignty issue is the big driver, and of course the left thinks sovereignty is important too. There's slightly different colorations of it, but the right scuttled the Law of the Sea Treaty because of sovereignty concerns. They scuttled the International Criminal Court because of sovereignty concerns, not wanting the U.S. to be bound by judgments of international tribunals. The Law of the Sea Treaty has some issues in it. And there have been a few treaties where the right has gotten really upset about sovereignty, and you need to draw the parallels between those where they clearly rejected the U.S. being bound and losing its sovereignty and saying, look, ISDS is even worse. And what's the difference? There is no difference. And so I think that's one way to look at it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We've got about maybe 2 more minutes to go, so let's see if we can get 2 more people.
Okay, our next question comes from area code 361. Your line is open.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stumo. I am majored in the dismal science back in the day when I was in college, but I was wondering if you have some way that you can explain currency misalignment in a way most people can understand what we're talking about. And the other thing is, in your course of talking with some of your Congress folks, if you come across this argument that one of the reasons we're having problems with unfair trade is because of the corporate tax rate, that we have to have tax reform in order to get things balanced.
Yeah, the number 2, I don't, tax reform in the way they're talking about it, I don't think is terribly relevant to trade, although there's some ways you could do a consumption tax and offset other taxes that would make a difference. On currency misalignment, our website has a report on currency misalignment and dollar overvaluation, and I'd encourage folks to take a look at it. We're hoping that becomes a big issue for us, and for we're telling the administration too. We don't see how you can make progress balancing trade unless you deal with exchange rate misalignment. And in fact, our trade deficit is up on an annualized basis by 10% this year versus last year. But basically, the dollar is over exchange. So let me give it a shot here. Exchange rates should adjust in a way so that trade becomes balanced, because if you have a persistent surplus, you're growing your economy, you're employing people, you're gaining tax revenue and the like, your currency should appreciate, which makes your goods more expensive, so people buy less of them. If you're Germany, for example, people should then be buying less because your currency goes up, and so then you come down to balance. If you're a deficit country, your employment is low, you're underutilized plants, your economy is not doing well, your currency should go down or become less expensive, which would mean your goods and services are cheaper on international markets. People buy more of them, of your goods on the international markets. You put people to work supplying those goods and services, your economy recovers. And the point is that exchange rates have lost their connection with a trade balancing equilibrium price. This isn't just from us, but this is from the globalists over at Peterson Institute. who we don't agree with on many things, but we agree with on this, and Rob Scott agrees with it as well, of EPI. And so even with manipulation not happening, with countries intentionally devaluing their currency, and by the way, an undervalued currency is the road to becoming a global leader, because that's how China's doing it, that's how Germany's doing it, although passively. Right now, they're not doing it, but the U.S. dollar is overvalued because, number one, we're the reserve currency in the world, so a lot of people buy dollars just to have dollars to buy goods on international markets, because you buy oil and other goods in international markets with dollars, not pesos. So you got to buy dollars to have them. That drives it up. Number two, we have a little bit higher interest rates than Europe and others, so people chase and arbitrage interest rates. And number three, we're a good place to store wealth. So if you're really interested, on Wednesday we have a CPA seminar or webinar on why exchange rate alignment exists and a mechanism to fix it. And we think we're going to be seeing legislation on that pretty soon. But it takes a little bit to get your head around on. I can't quite get it to the 30-second elevator speech yet, but that's the best I can do right now.
Thank you.
Michael, can you tell people a link or where to go for that webinar?
How about if I send something to you, Harriet, and you distribute it?
That's terrific. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Okay, our next question comes from area code 561. Your line is open.
Hi, Cameron Stemple with Progressive Democrats of America, Palm Beach County. I have an upcoming town hall with my representative who's a Republican in a sort of split district. And I was wondering what would be the best way to approach and ask about either getting a firm stance on ISDS, or what aspect of NAFTA I should be trying to get him locked down on.
You might want to try with ISDS, like I said before, saying, look, who's your rep that you're going to meet with?
Brian Mast.
Okay, I don't know him that much.
His likely response will be to paint the trade deal as getting rid of red tape and deregulating for quote unquote small businesses to thrive. It's a total sham, but that's probably the response I'll get.
Yeah, well, I have no silver bullet for you, but you might want to say, look, conservatives rejected the law of the sea treaty and the International Criminal Court on grounds that interferes with U.S. sovereignty. ISDS is worse. And conservatives have, and you can say that factually, conservatives have opposed ISDS because of sovereignty. Are you prepared to do the same? And then on, trade, it's not a matter of net. We want to be a net exporter. We're a net importer. So you say, look, would you be willing to commit to, agreements and trade policy that makes us a net exporter rather than a net importer? That it'd be interesting to hear his response if you say net.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's really great. Well, one thing I would just say, everybody, is go to your town halls and ask them to commit. Ask them what they're going to do and make them take a stand on the spot. That really does make a difference. It either makes them look kind of lame if they won't take a position, and if they do take a position, it's a big deal. So that's the most important thing. Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yep. Have a great one. All right. I would now like to introduce our next speaker. This is Celeste Drake. She is the Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist at the AFL-CIO. Celeste works to improve U.S. trade policy so it doesn't send more jobs overseas, and also to improve labor rights for workers overseas so that workers globally can race to the top instead of having global corporations push us all to the bottom. Celeste earned a Bachelor of Arts and a law degree and a Master's in Public Policy from UCLA. Welcome, Celeste.
Hi. Can you hear me okay, Harriet?
Yep, you sound terrific.
Okay, great. So I'm happy to be here. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time to call in. I'll try to be fairly brief and allow time for questions. So this first slide is just kind of, rather than going in on the explanation of all the ways that the NAFTA rules have put our economy and North America's whole economy on the wrong track, I'm just kind of showing a summary of that in some photos. So whether we're talking about offshoring of jobs, making work less safe, enhancing the gap between worker productivity and worker wages, worker resistance, all of those things are effects of NAFTA. And that is why we support this renegotiation and attempt to change the rules to make them more worker-centric. Next slide, please. So here's the question. And I think Michael Stumo did a really great job of trying to explain, just because there is some convergence on some views, for instance, that trade should be reformed, and that it's not working well for most people in the American economy, should not be confused with an attempt to say, let's go ahead and work with the xenophobes or the white nationalists or other folks. I mean, those just are not folks that the labor movement is working with or wants to work with, or that we would recommend others do so. There's a long history in this country of left-right cooperation on many issues, and that's not a problem, but there's a point where folks on the right become, as I think Michael Stumo called them, the weirdos, and they're just not folks we can work with. However, that doesn't mean we should give up on fighting NAFTA and fighting corporate trade and fighting for a better economy and what's right. And I have heard that. I've heard, well, if Trump supports a NAFTA renegotiation, then it must be bad. We have to fight back when people say that. So it really is important to note that silence is not the answer, and saying I won't engage with the Trump administration shouldn't mean that you won't engage in the fight for fair trade. So we've got to stand up and fight for what's right, and that's really important, especially now, because if folks are not hearing from us and not hearing that the fight for fair trade and better trade and progressive trade is totally separate from whatever the white nationalists are doing, they're going to make their own connections. So we really do need to speak up. Next slide, please. So this is really what we want, what the AFL-CIO wants, what working people want, and that's a whole new North American economy. So not a NAFTA with tweaks, not just a little, comma here and a new sentence there. It's really, we want an economy that works, that's creating more jobs with better wages, and that's creating demand in the economy. So there's more investment, the banks are lending, the economy's growing, public revenues are actually rising in a responsible manner so that we can invest in the things that we haven't been investing in our country and across North America for the past 30 years. And once we invest more in education and infrastructure, that moves the economy in the right direction. So that's what we're shooting for. Next slide, please. So folks may have seen this. It's a two-pager. The AFL-CIO put out nearly 50 pages of recommendations on just exactly how to do NAFTA in a way that works for working people. Folks here are probably fairly familiar with the things that we're looking for: open, democratic, and transparent negotiations, no ISDS, strong labor rules that have swift and certain enforcement, strong environmental rules that have swift and certain enforcement, currency reform, Michael Stumo talked a lot about that, strong rules of origin, rules that don't undermine Buy American and other fiscal initiatives, on and on and on. This two-pager is available on our website, AFL-CIO.org, and if you just Google AFL-CIO NAFTA recommendations, you can pull this down and print it and use it if you're interested. Next slide, please. So what do we know that works about our fight against fast track and against TPP? We know that we win when we can stand together. We know that we win when our members understand what's at stake. So we do have to do that education piece and tell people, no, this isn't just about protectionism, and no, this isn't because we didn't take an economics class. This really is about something else, and it's about our control over our economy and not giving up the rules to global corporations. Building a broad coalition of people that can agree on principles and values, and again, we have to be willing to talk to others, but not willing to engage at all with the neo-Nazis and the racists. And we have to use multiple tactics and multiple platforms. As people have heard me say much before, you don't win with an internet-only strategy. We've got to talk to folks face-to-face. Next slide, please. So what does a win look like? And I think that's going to change as these NAFTA talks go on, because what we might be fighting for right now, in 2 weeks or 4 weeks, it might be clear that that's not possible, or the talks have gone in another direction. So we have to be nimble and flexible and bend like the reeds to see what our goal is. So right now, we want to make sure that what's being talked about in kind of the mainstream press, that it's just a modernization of NAFTA, that there's Democratic and Republican support for making NAFTA tweaked a little bit to look more like TPP, that somehow that's an acceptable outcome. We have to be really clear that's not, in fact, an acceptable outcome. And in fact, the president himself, who many of us disagree with, but that shouldn't be an acceptable outcome to him. He pulled out of the TPP. How in the world is making the NAFTA look more like the TPP a fix, right? So that's what we have to do. And at some point, this goal might become kill the renegotiation, because it's obvious it's become the same old global corporate deal. But right now, we're not there yet. We need to be open to the fact that we can push this in the right direction, and we need to be pushing that. So it doesn't make any sense at this point for folks to just say, don't renegotiate. There was, at the negotiations here in D.C. last week, one of the reporters said, hey, why didn't you guys have a rally? Why didn't you guys have a protest? And I said, well, what would we be protesting? We want NAFTA renegotiated. We want to see what will happen. So, I mean, it's nobody protests just to protest. And they said, oh, yeah, good point. It was really interesting. Next slide, please. So, again, we want to make sure that we're shaping what that message is. If somebody says that word modernized, we fight back and say that's actually not what this is about. It's not about just getting new rules that help the new internet economy. It's about a whole new economic deal for North American working families. And by using those phrases, we're making clear that this isn't about America first or America only. It's about American workers and Mexican workers and Canadian workers. And it's about a whole new economic deal, so that we don't have to somehow justify NAFTA or pretend that we like NAFTA. We want to replace it with a whole new deal. Next slide, please. Okay, so the USTR's published objectives, as I testified before the Ways and Means Committee, we said they're too vague and they're not as ambitious as we would have liked. And I'm just going to talk about that a little bit. And there are obviously risks here. And there are always risks when there are trade negotiations on the table. What was produced could produce the TPP all over again. There were many places where the objectives were word for word what Ambassador Froman had published about the TPP back in 2015. So there's a danger. On the other hand, what the bright side is that USTR, no matter what USTR it is, has a history of being vague to the public. And so what is published to the public doesn't necessarily reveal all of what's being talked about at USTR. So there could be more going on there than what we see. Also, the way that fast track works, deals can be brought to Congress and receive the fast track privileges so long as the president has certified that progress was made toward the negotiating objectives. So that also means that everything that you see in those published objectives isn't necessarily exactly what you're going to get. And it's in that space, that flexible space, that we have work to do. And we can push to say, we don't like what was published, it didn't go far enough, or it went too far in the wrong direction, and here's what we're working for. So specifically, there was an introduction to the NAFTA negotiating objectives, and that was a little bit disappointing because though it mentioned workers in two places, it said that NAFTA has created problems for workers, which is true. And it says that in the past, politicians gave workers hope that NAFTA would be fixed, and then it never happened. That's also true. Then it stopped talking about workers, and at the end it summarized, it said, under these objectives, a new NAFTA will give our farmers, ranchers, service providers, and other businesses new opportunities to grow their exports and reclaim American prosperity. But more importantly, the new NAFTA will promote a market system that functions more efficiently, leading to reciprocal and balanced trade among the parties. So that's all fine, except for it doesn't say what the new NAFTA is going to do for working people. It doesn't say what the new NAFTA is going to do for wages. It doesn't say what the new NAFTA is going to do that's different than the existing NAFTA. And so that's the key. It's missing. So our working people and our lives and our quality of life and our wages, important to this or not? So on the trade in goods objectives, the language is pretty standard, but there is some worrying language that indicates that NAFTA is going to be used to ratchet down food and product safety standards. And, you know, when you talk about trying to create efficiencies, that's actually okay. There's nothing wrong with trying to find efficiencies, because if that can end up being good for consumers, good for business, then great. But how do you create efficiencies? Is it always adopting the lower standard, which is the history of trade since this new comprehensive model? Then that's a problem. If the language had said, look, where differences exist, when we harmonize, we will always adopt higher levels of protection, that would be a fantastic standard, and we didn't see that. And in fact, we've never seen that as a goal in any trade negotiation. And it reveals a lot about what the companies are talking about when they simply complain about, oh, it's too hard to follow many standards. You know, I'm sure it's really hard to run a multi-billion-dollar company, and you know, I'm sure they don't have enough money to follow different rules in different places, even though they're doing it. But if it were really just about ease, the companies themselves would say, and we offer to follow the single highest standard, because that would be one standard and it would take away all the complications for them. But they don't ever volunteer to do that. So it does tell you a little bit about what's behind what they're using. So in the sanitary and phytosanitary objectives, those are around food safety. It says that they want to make clear that each country can set for itself the level of protection it believes to be appropriate for food safety. That's great, right? That respects your democracy and your democratic rulemaking and your sovereignty. But then in the past, that kind of language has been tempered by obligations to quote-unquote use science-based standards. And in the trade realm, science-based doesn't really mean what you think it means. And it has been used in many cases to attack rules that are in fact science-based if companies that are trying to peddle a dangerous or a toxic product can find one or two studies, usually that they themselves funded, to say, oh no, there's no danger here. So it's unfortunate that even the term science is now not clear in its meaning. The customs and trade facilitation goals and objectives, they're fine, but again, it has something critical missing here, and that's a commitment to adequately fund the Customs and Border Protection Service so that it can find goods that are made with forced labor, that it can find counterfeit goods, that it can find goods that are evading duties and do all those things that we want for fair and balanced trade. The rules of origin objectives, the problem there is they're too vague to let us know if something real is going to be achieved or even tried. The technical barriers to trade language indicates they want to follow the WTO standards, and it's the WTO standards that were used to overturn things like country of origin labeling and dolphin-safe tuna labeling, so that's not good. In the trade and services, it says they're going to make commitments on a negative list basis. Negative lists are a problem for many reasons. What they do is they commit countries to any new service that's ever sort of conceived of, invented, developed. They have to comply with the rules in the trade agreements. And if you think about new services that might be coming online now and in the future, self-driving cars, other forms of international artificial intelligence, if you can't deal with those in the regulatory way that you need to, that's a problem. The investment objectives were too vague and didn't make clear whether ISDS would be in or out, so that's a question. The state-owned enterprises objectives were a really good start, but not specific enough. The labor objectives look like a carbon copy from the TPP, which we believed was wholly inadequate. Likewise, the environment language was a carbon copy of the TPP, which we thought was wholly inadequate. The trade remedies objectives were, we thought, a real highlight and the high point of the published objectives. The government procurement objectives didn't make clear they were eliminating specific procurement obligations, so that was a disappointment. The currency objectives, again, they were vague, and they could have produced sort of a meaningless side agreement like the TPP. So this is the problem. It's not that the objectives are awful, but they do indicate that NAFTA could go down the wrong track and could maybe not achieve the things that we want. So that's why we look at them. We keep an eye on them. President Trumka from the AFL-CIO criticized them and said, okay, so we're criticizing these. That doesn't mean we give up. We're engaging. We're working. We're going to try and push USTR and the administration to be better, to do better than what they published in the objectives. Next slide, please. So round one report, round one finished today. Some of our key issues for working people were not really a focus in the round. There was no stakeholder engagement as they had under the Obama administration, although that stakeholder engagement wasn't particularly useful, so that's kind of neither here nor there. There was no public briefing. There were briefings each day for, the cleared advisors. This is the official trade advisory process. So those folks are informed, but they are prevented by law from sharing what they know with the general public. We had called for, in the spirit of transparency and democracy, publications of draft proposals before the round. That didn't happen. And then we've said, well, afterwards you can come back and you can show the public what you did put down on the table, because now it's no longer secret to the other side. There's no real advantage to keep it secret unless you do not want to share it with the American people. And so they haven't promised to do that, but we're going to keep pushing them to do it because, again, we don't take no for an answer. That's our job, is to push and to be active. Next slide, please. So we want to make sure, again, as people are thinking about how do you engage, after what happened in Virginia, and I would just emphasize, don't conflate making demands on the administration and making demands of the negotiators with working with. because those are different things, and you can certainly make demands without saying, this is an administration that I feel comfortable working with, because a lot of people are no longer comfortable working with, given what happened and the statements the president made last week. And we should remember that we were able to change the agenda on the TPP, and that we are powerful enough to do it again if we do the work. And so that's the end, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Celeste. If you could stick with us, we're going to do a combined Q&A with Bill. Can you stick with us?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was really great. So hang with us, everybody. I would now like to introduce Bill Waren. He is the Senior Trade Analyst at Friends of the Earth U.S., and he works to protect the environment from the negative impacts of international trade and investment agreements. His research, writings, and advocacy have focused on trade deals like the TPP, the TTIP, NAFTA, and TISA, as well as litigation under existing trade and investment agreements. Almost said ingredients there. Prior to joining Friends of the Earth, Bill served as Policy Director at the Forum on Democracy and Trade and as a Senior Fellow at the Harrison Institute for Public Law, Georgetown University Law Center. He is a native of rural downstate Illinois, and he took a bachelor's in politics and a master's in public administration at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and a law degree at Duke Law School and an LLM in public interest advocacy at Georgetown Law. Bill, you with us?
I'm here. I sure appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you so much. You've got the mic.
Okay. Well, I would have to say that the attitude of Friends of the Earth and most environmental advocates we're very, very angry with Mr. Trump. He has declared war on the planet in a whole variety of ways. He scandalized the whole world by withdrawing the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement. He's unleashed Scott Pruitt to completely destroy the Environmental Protection Agency from the inside. They're trying to decertify national monuments. I could go down the list. We don't trust him in any way. I think that his attitude on environmental policy is one of the few areas where he's predictable. And it's, I think, a 100% sure thing that in anything he does, including renegotiating NAFTA, that he is going to keep up and accelerate his war on the planet. And indeed, Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, has noted that especially when it comes to issues of deregulation in the SPS and TBT chapters and other chapters that Celeste mentioned, that they're likely to import provisions from the Trans-Pacific Partnership that are even worse than the old NAFTA or the World Trade Organization rules with respect to environment. It's very, very clear to us that Trump's goal is to hamstring and roll back effective environmental regulation across the board and to accelerate global warming. He clearly wants to use trade deals to ramp up production and consumption of the fossil fuels that are threatening civilization of the planet itself in coming decades. Let me go through a list of about, if you want to go to the next slide, the first point, and this is the one people have talked about, and that's the ISDS, or investment tribunals. These international investment tribunals are a particular threat to sound environmental and climate policy. We've seen in a variety of international investment agreements, that environment regulations are a top target. And the important thing to remember is that these tribunals are very effective enforcement mechanisms. They can sue governments. These are private suits brought by rich investors and global corporations, and they can literally get millions or billions of dollars when environmental or other public interest regulations interfere with their expected future profits. And just as one well-known example, under the old NAFTA, TransCanada, the company responsible for the Keystone XL pipeline, used a provision in the current NAFTA agreement, the ISDS provision, to sue the United States for $15 billion after the Obama administration halted construction of that project. And they dropped that suit only when Trump reversed policy and gave the project a go-ahead, and then he was no longer fussy about whether the pipeline had to be built with U.S. or foreign steel. But, of course, there are other very effective, this is what distinguishes international environmental law from international trade and investment law, whereas the Paris Agreement and all the other international environmental agreements depend on the voluntary cooperation of the signatories. These agreements are effectively enforced by transnational tribunals and are really run by the corporate trade lawyers who appear as plaintiff's counsel in one case and as arbitrator in the next, particularly with the investment tribunals. But there are other provisions that where it's a state-to-state dispute. That is, if Mexico were to sue the United States on, let's say, dolphin-safe tuna labeling, which they've done frequently in the WTO, and if there are other kinds, or if Canada and the United States were to engage in litigation, then those disputes, or those decisions can be very effectively enforced with retaliatory trade sanctions, although not money damages, and that could be something like authorizing the winning party to impose high tariffs on goods or services of the country that failed to come into compliance. For example, you might put a high tariff on Harley-Davidson motorcycles made in Wisconsin, or on oranges from Florida in an election year, in order to put maximum pressure on the government to roll back important environmental regulations. One thing I want to emphasize: this is the so-called Chapter 20 trade tribunals, as opposed to the Chapter 19 tribunals, which are getting a lot of press, which is a totally separate matter. And also, we worry about general regulatory review provisions. It's not absolutely clear what Trump plans to do here, but given his profound hostility to government regulation and environmental and climate regulation generally, we're very worried that he's going to create institutions and procedures that could kill administrative rules on climate and the environment before they even see the light of day. And the precedent here is a brainchild of Ronald Reagan, and that's the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. It has a reputation in the United States of endlessly delaying and blocking federal agency rules on the environment and climate. And I think there's a possibility, as was discussed in the U.S.-European Union negotiations, of creating some kind of a transnational equivalent of the so-called OIRA regulatory review process. And beyond that, such a regulatory review process, could set up procedures for mutual recognition of environmental standards or food safety standards, and a bureaucratic process for identifying alleged excessive burdens on business to slow down, stop, or roll back environmental, climate, health, and other public interest regulations. And what we know is that in many cases, this regulatory review process relies on totally, fairly bogus business-friendly cost-benefit analysis that inherently gives disproportionate weight to quantitative data and economic costs, and while diminishing the perceived importance of qualitative benefits like saving lives or maintaining the equilibrium of the global ecosystem or protecting wild places. And this process is hardly scientific, even though they call it rigorous science, because they try to impute a dollar cost to a human life by looking at future earning capacity and things like that. It's not like a civil engineering problem. And just to run through the particular areas of threat, obviously a big threat to sound climate policy. Trump's made it clear he wants to drill and export fossil fuels all over the planet and burn them as quickly as possible. I mean, nothing could be more clear. We think that public purchasing standards that ensure that government contracts support renewable energy efficiency, sustainable goods, so-called green purchasing, would be very worried that they're going to go after that. And obviously, one of the biggest concerns is the deregulation of chemical safety standards. I mean, you're talking about dangerous chemicals that are associated with breast cancer, infertility, actually gender issues, and we have a very weak federal system of chemicals regulation in the United States, but California and some other jurisdictions have strong standards, and we have to really worry about the preemption of California law and other subnational law. And moreover, it would put a cap on and prevent reform at the federal level in the future. In terms of family farms, if there's one thing that's absolutely clear about these trade agreements and NAFTA in particular, is to increase the volatility of agricultural markets and put sustainable farm families at risk, and increase corporate control of agriculture. And just look what happened to Mexico after the first NAFTA. All those small farmers were put out of business, and that's why we had the huge migration over the Rio Grande and across the border. Celeste mentioned the so-called SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures provisions. These are food safety provisions and animal welfare safeguards. And all the corporate lobbyists are talking about not only mimicking, the current really bad SPS or food safety provisions in existing agreements, but to have SPS plus, and you can see one Federal Register comment after another from industry that's what they're looking for. So we really see even more threatening legal attacks on the safety of our food and the decent treatment of our farm animals. And we also worry that private certification of safety may be substituted for government certification. We see lots of threats in terms of genetically modified organisms, synthetic biology, and so forth, not only in the SPS chapter, but in the intellectual property chapter. And this is a classic case where we believe the precautionary principle has to apply. We don't need to have phony or excessively high standards of scientific certainty when the risk, the unknown risk, is a basic threat to the environment and to human health. And when you talk about synthetic biology in particular, it's really a dangerous and a totally unknown area, and we don't need to have that ridiculously high standard of scientific certainty. And then just to elaborate on chemicals, pesticide, rollback of pesticide and blocking new pesticide regulations, very important. Just as one example, the bees are dying, and that's only bad for the bees. It threatens our food system because they're the pollinators, and the TBT, Technical Barriers to Trade chapter, is a clear threat to the bees, our food supply, and to the animal world in general. So that's my summary.
Okay, so now we're going to open the lines, everybody, for Q&A. So if you have a question for Bill or for Celeste, you can press *6 on your phone. And in the meantime, while we're waiting, I have a question. I was going to ask Bill. Most of us out here in the hinterlands are involved in issues like pipelines, water, cleanliness, and chemical levels. How do you have an idea about how we can frame the discussion to get people on the level that are working on these issues to take trade seriously and to understand that it's a reason why we're always having these fires that we're trying to put out?
Well, I think that when it comes to environmental policy, you can get into the weeds, but I think it's important to communicate to the public and to your members of Congress what discussion of the personal character of the President of the United States and his record when it comes to sensible environmental policy and his willingness to put the planet at risk by ignoring and denying the fact of climate change. And then you can segue into some of the more specific issues. But if there's anything that's absolutely clear and consistent about Donald Trump, is he wants to roll back regulations, and particularly environmental regulations, and there's every indication that his trade negotiators are going to follow through on this. I mean, Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce, has been very clear that he wanted to see many of the provisions of the TPP, brought over into NAFTA 2.0, particularly when it comes to regulatory issues as opposed to some of the jobs issues.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Carrie, how are we doing on the call board here?
We're doing really well. We've got a queue full of people, so I'm going to start moving through our question queue, and I'd just like to remind our questioners to please ask a brief question, make it on point, and say whether you would like Celeste or Bill to answer the question.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to thank Ms. Drake and Mr. Waren. My question is, I'm a member of the AFL-CIO. I guess my question's for Ms. Drake. I am a member of the AFL-CIO through AFT, and they do a great job here. But what does your national what do your national leaders do to stir action from the members? I called the local chapter here, and they did not really respond, and then I called them again and acted. I was calling in regard to fast track, and so anyway, that they didn't seem to want to engage with the public, and even though I'm a member, and so I'm just wondering how do they stir members to action?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because the AFL-CIO, we're a federation, so our members are actually the affiliates like AFT, AFSCME, steelworkers, painters. And we don't have, the actual union members are then like a step removed from us. So how we do try to stir up action is we do have an e-activist list that we built up during the fast track fight, and I would encourage you to join it. And you can do that by going to the AFL-CIO.org blog, and you can find one of our recent blogs on NAFTA. Go to the bottom, and you'll click to sign a petition, and that'll get you on our list. You can also join our text list by texting the word TRADE, TRADE, to 235246, and that'll put you on our activist list through texts, and the texts are pretty, they're not overwhelming. It's usually no more than one action per month, so it's not burdensome to sign up for. But the other things that we do is we provide information. We provide fact sheets and meetings in a box and talking points, and we make that available to all of our affiliates and ask them to then, send those down the line from the nationals to the state or the regional and their locals or their lodges or however they are organized. And then the AFL-CIO directly has state chapters and local chapters, usually known as CLCs or Central Labor Councils. And I've been contacted by a number of folks who were saying, my local isn't particularly active on trade, because of X, Y, or Z, but I went to a special meeting at my CLC, or I got involved in volunteering through the CLC. So I would say, try to figure out what your local Central Labor Council is and give them a call. So there's a lot of ways. And also, unions themselves, we're democratic organizations. So, I would say try again with your local. If your local teachers aren't involved, go to the next meeting or the next time you meet with your steward on campus and say, we need to get more involved in this, and it's actually really important because, and I've heard President Randy Weingarten of the AFT talk about how when foreign companies come and run private schools, which they do for profit, whether it's charter school systems or test prep organizations or things of this nature, all of a sudden they're a foreign investor that, depending on what country they're coming from, may have access to this investor-to-state dispute settlement if they believe that the government has then tried to regulate them in a way that they find is threatening to their interests. And this is really dangerous. For instance, as states are coming to find out that a lot of charter schools are excluding children with special needs in a way that public schools rightly are not allowed to do, if they try to say, look, if you're going to be a private charter school provider, you've got to serve these children as well. We don't want that challenged in an ISDS lawsuit. So, these issues are, in fact, really critical to teachers. It's not the stereotypical factory worker who's the only person being hurt by bad trade deals. So I would say there's a lot of opportunities, and I really appreciate your interest, and I really encourage you to try all of these avenues to get involved.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Celeste. Our next question comes from Nancy. Nancy, is your line open?
Yes, thank you very much. My question is for Bill. It seems to me the way you outline the range of environmental and climate impacts that these two topics might be the way to really accelerate the critique of NAFTA, because frontline communities are working against fracking and all sorts of other corporate harms, and there's much more awareness about climate, and there's much more evidence about the climate and extreme weather impacts. So it seems to me that climate and environmental impacts might be a really good avenue for critiquing NAFTA, and also critiquing any of the TPP aspects brought into NAFTA, especially the harmonization chapter and some of the other environmental aspects of TPP. Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely on point. I think I would emphasize the climate and global warming issues above all else. It's crystal clear that Donald Trump wants to cook the planet, and I think that his record of radical deregulation of a sensible environmental safeguard is well established, and he clearly is going to pursue that agenda by all means at his disposal. And while Bob Lighthizer and Wilbur Ross may have a few views on jobs issues or national sovereignty issues that are a little bit different from past administrations, although I think the Wall Street gang is pretty well precluded. Mnuchin and others have pretty well precluded the opportunity for major reforms in those areas. But there isn't a single voice for common sense in the environment in the Trump administration or in the Trump trade team. So I think that you cannot underestimate the threat. It's really quite serious. And in trying to communicate to people, I'd start with the climate issue.
So could I just ask a follow-up question? Are the principles of national treatment and most favored nation, they can be used to make an ISDS claim. If you don't have ISDS, can those principles still be used, or are they just linked to ISDS?
Oh, no, in Chapter 20, Trade Tribunal litigation, there's similar rules like that, and the investment rules are much more specific and dangerous, but the regular trade tribunal rules are plenty dangerous as well. I mean, the World Trade Organization does not have ISDS, but it has trade tribunals, which have come down with a lot of really bad decisions that have proved to be crippling.
But can most favored nation and national treatment be used in the ISDS kind of tribunal? The reason I ask
in effect, yes. Yeah.
In effect, yes. Because the reason I ask is cities and counties, in using land use, they principally are engaged in land use and other kinds of development decisions. And if they're trying to protect land and protect environment, then it's important, it seems to me, to point out that local sovereignty in protecting the environment is lost.
That's right, because if your locality, even if it's not an ISDS case, if it's a regular trade case, the national economy or your local industry can be punished by retaliatory trade sanctions or loss of intellectual property rights, and it's very dangerous. And of course, the investment tribunals are 4 times worse.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we have a lot of questioners in our queue. So our next question comes from caller at area code 20212. Your line is open.
Oh, hello. This is Donna in New York, and I just lost my place. Sorry. Sorry, you caught me off guard here.
Sorry, I know you sat for a little while waiting.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
Celeste, basically, I'm with Trade Justice Alliance in New York. Celeste, basically what you're saying is that the parts of the trade that may sound okay is dangerous because it's open to interpretation, which is not anything that we can trust. So we need the wording to be clear if we have any say in the shaping of the message. So how do we have a say in the shaping of the message?
That's exactly the right.
Other than what we're doing and protesting, whatever.
Yeah, that's the right question because look, the trade agreements are essentially contracts, right? They're contracts between countries. And, as any of us know, if we've ever tried to get, we've had a dispute with our credit card provider, our bank, our insurance company, maybe over our auto loan, maybe over our mortgage, it's pages and pages of stuff that, the salesperson never wants you to actually sit down and take the time to read. And then when you try to settle a dispute, well, there's something on, you know, Article 529 where that's excluded, or Article 632 where you have to use arbitration, or, you know, Article 70 where you can't do a class action suit, or all of these things. And so at least, you know, you want to be able to see what those things are while they're being negotiated so you can impact what they are. And if you think about it like any other bill that Congress is passing, you can do that. When they introduce the bill, it's online. You can go look at it at congress.gov. You can download it. You can read it. You can then write a letter to your 2 senators and your representative, and you can say, if this comes up, I want you to take out, you know, Article 2 and add in a new section that says this, you know, or I just oppose the whole thing because it's too backwards and it can't be fixed, or please move on this bill because it's really important and I love it just the way it is. You can't do that with the trade agreements if they are not publishing the legal text. So as I went through and sort of said, here's what the objectives say and here's sort of what's dangerous about what they say, that's the point, is that we know that these objectives have been used to describe things that turn into legal text that are then very dangerous. If you look at how those terms have been applied either in the existing NAFTA, at the WTO, in other bilateral or regional trade agreements, and really the very best way to say this is how it would be applied is to see the text. And the rest of it is all going to be sort of smoke and mirrors and promises, because if they're not showing you the legal text, we can't be guaranteed about what it means. And so the process is really important. And here's the thing. I was actually reading today the tri-national statement that came out, the 3 countries put out at the end of the negotiations today, and they said something about, you know, subject matter experts are you know, working on all these issues to come up with the best text possible. And that right there is a lie, because they're not subject matter experts. What these people are trade negotiators who happen to be very familiar with trade rules in the area of environmental or labor or food safety or digital trade or financial services. But they're not, in fact, financial services experts, because those folks don't work at the Trade Negotiation Agency. Those folks, you know, work at the SEC or the Consumer Financial, what's it called? The new thing that was just created out of Dodd-Frank. And right, and the people that really are labor experts work in the Department of Labor, and the people that are environmental experts work at the EPA. And if you were going to write a trade agreement that really said we really want to respect all of these things, even as we're advancing trade, that's very doable. It's extremely doable. It's just never been done. And what trade agreements do, and the essential, if you wanted to boil it down to an elevator speech, is their main problem is they elevate the quote-unquote right to trade, in other words, an exporter's right to export, above anything else. So if there's a regulation that's actually good for animal welfare, good for raising wages, good for keeping toxic effluents out of the water, if those things are viewed as burdensome to an exporter trying to sell the good into your borders, or a foreign investor trying to make the good inside your borders, they're going to be open to challenge. And the trade tribunal, whether it's investor state, which is the most dangerous because there's no sort of political filter that says, oh, this would be bad for us to bring. Companies don't care about that. They have one obligation, to raise profits for their shareholders. Or whether it's state to state, and you see a lot fewer of those cases, because at least sometimes governments are thinking, oh, we shouldn't bring that case because we wouldn't want someone to bring that case against us. But if the only standard of the tribunal is this more burdensome on trade than necessary, you're going to get decisions that are bad, in fact, for the animals, the people, the land, the water that you're trying to protect. And so that's kind of what all this boils down to. And the number one thing that you want to do is get access to the text, so demand transparency. And the number two thing that you want to do is say the whole thing, when you put it together, has to say that people and the planet are more important than profits. And it sounds like, a bumper sticker line, but that's the only way that you can boil down to how should 1,000 pages of trade rules look. And so a lot of times if you're saying people and the planet are more important than profits, then there's a lot of stuff that trade agreements have done that they just don't need to do. They don't need to, in fact, get really involved in what the food safety rules are and how you can regulate Wall Street and all of those things. Those are just not necessary. So I would concentrate on sending those two messages and send those messages to your elected officials. And if you're in New York, it's likely, it's a heavily Democratic team, and they still need to hear the message. They're not right just because they're Democrats. And if your elected officials are Republican, they need to hear the message. They're not necessarily going to not listen to you just because they're Republicans. We have to make equal demands on everyone regardless of what their party is.
Great, thanks. We have time for one more question. So make it a good one.
Okay, make it a good one. Well, we have a lot of sad people in the queue, but I'll tell you what, Celeste is very good, and so is Bill, about answering questions in the chat box sometimes too. So if you want to, if we have a few minutes still during the news report, if you want to post your questions over there, we might be able to get an answer for you. In the meantime, we have one more question from the folks at area code 503. Your line is open.
I was thinking about Trump's radical deregulation. And I remember Bill Waren, I think, was the guy who was saying this, but he was saying Trump's going to cook the planet. I don't think that's a good argument to use. But I was thinking, since Trump was basically he hired people who were specifically there to basically destroy the regulatory agency. He put these people in to destroy. You know what I'm getting at? And I was just thinking, sure. Isn't that a good argument to make? Being that in politics the argument is more important than the fact, I was just thinking you could actually just basically focus on the fact that he's basically putting people in regulatory positions to destroy the regulation.
Yeah, that was the point I was trying to make. And you were much more succinct and much easier to understand in making that same point. I mean, there's a clear record here of his approach to environmental and climate regulation, and there's no reason to believe he's going to be any different when it comes to trade policy. If anything, there's every reason to believe that he'll be even more dangerous when it comes to trade policy.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody. And Celeste, if you could hopefully stick with us a while longer, and you too, Bill. And if people have questions and you can use the chat box, that would be terrific. We have to move on down the line, and our next speaker is Hugh Campbell. Hugh J. Campbell, Jr. Is a CPA and CFCS. He is a seasoned financial professional who has held positions as Chief Risk Officer and Chief Audit Executive. His activism focuses primarily on economic justice issues and opening primaries and caucuses to independent voters. He was a member of the Trade Justice Alliance Planning Team and the Coalition for a Prosperous America, the Network Lobby, and Public Citizen. Hugh contributes regularly also on the U.S. Steelworkers blog. Hugh, is your line open?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay, thanks. Yep, you sound great.
Thanks for the introduction, Harriet.
You're welcome.
The first two trade news slides this month relate to the first round of NAFTA renegotiations. Starting off with, we have U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer's opening statement. The most telling aspect of Lighthizer's opening statement is what was omitted, namely no mention of the environment. Next, we have a press release by the Coalition of Prosperous America, which appreciates the U.S. Trade Ambassador Lighthizer's focus on the trade deficit and rules of origin in NAFTA renegotiations. CPA supports the fact that major reform is needed in NAFTA to benefit American workers and business, and they emphasize, as Michael Stumo did earlier, if major reform cannot be achieved, walking away from NAFTA should be a seriously considered option. Next, the auto industry groups from Canada, Mexico, and the United States are pushing back against the Trump administration's demand for higher U.S. automotive content in a modernized North America free trade agreement. Next, we have on the top of the second slide, trade news slide, an article entitled NAFTA renegotiation could affect supply chain, raise costs, and end the deal entirely. The bottom line of this article is the U.S. wants to strengthen rules of origin to ensure products from non-NAFTA countries don't have the same benefit as those produced in the region. The next article deals with intellectual property. It's a very complicated article. It talks about how if the copyrights are extended and certain rules regarding downloading videos, etc., are put into effect, the cost of Netflix and textbooks, etc., might increase. The article ends with the comment, hopefully the final agreement from NAFTA doesn't force changes in the United States that will raise the cost of Netflix, delay C.S. Lewis's works from entering the public domain, or harm secondary book market. The next article, Pence says NAFTA will be a win-win. Speaking to business leaders in Santiago, Chile, U.S. Vice President Michael Pence said he was confident a renegotiation of NAFTA trade pact between the United States, Mexico, and Canada will be a win-win, but gave no reasons why. The next two news slides this month relate to other trade news. Even though China is not mentioned in every article, China is in fact mentioned. Even though China is not mentioned in the title of every article, China is in fact mentioned in every article. Heading the third slide, we have an article titled U.S. Message to China Hands Off Our Companies. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Concerns began to grow under the previous administration as investments surged, with then President Barack Obama taking a rare step in blocking a Chinese technology deal on his way out of office, and have only continued to intensify during the current administration. Lawmakers and the Treasury are considering changes to the review process that could further tighten scrutiny on Chinese investment. Chinese dealmakers are battling similar concerns from European regulators as well. Next article, somewhat related. Even as regulators in China and abroad block deals, China acquirers will spend $1.5 trillion buying companies abroad in the next decade, 70% more than the previous 10 years. This next article, which in my opinion is the most important article of the bunch, but is neglected. Only in Germany have we seen thinkers grapple seriously with China's goal to become the world's leading industrial power and what it means to the rest of us. A 2016 German report commented, in the long term, China wants to obtain control over the most profitable segments of the global supply chain and production networks. If successful, Made in China 2025 could accelerate the erosion of industrial countries' technological leadership across industrial sectors. The next slide, the final trade slide, begins with an opinion piece from The Hill by Corey Lewandowski, who served as Trump's campaign manager during his presidential campaign. Since 2000, the U.S. steel industry has lost almost 48,000 jobs, including 14,000 in the last 18 months. This reality has put critical national security infrastructure at immediate risk. The U.S. military depends on steel to support our troops who sacrifice their lives and limb to keep us safe from those who wish to do us harm. The next article, which is kind of related to the previous one and reinforces it, is by Stephen Copeland, who served as chairman of the U.S. International Trade Commission under Presidents Clinton and Bush. In this article, it's pointed out that U.S. primary aluminum industry is on the verge of entirely disappearing, and the U.S. steel industry is not far behind. The next article, which is the last, Buy American movement gathers force. President Trump's Buy America Week was largely a feel-good event, but behind the scenes there is growing nationwide support in the political and business world for more U.S. spending to go on American-made goods and services. That's all I have.
Thanks, Hugh. And everybody, we will be sending out the newsletter in a couple weeks, so these stories will be available. You'll be able to look them up. And we want to thank Hugh very much for giving us the Hugh's News, Hugh's Trade News.
Thank you, Harriet.
Thanks, Hugh. I'm gonna very quickly go over the action updates now. We have the Public Citizens Global Trade Watch action update. They have a few really important points. It's the August recess, so it's really, really important. I can't stress this enough. If you can't meet with your member of Congress in office, I know they're hard to pin down this time of the year, please go out to your town halls. And, the big thing with them is, get them on the spot and get them out to answer a yes or no question. That's the important thing. Public Citizen has postcards also for your members of Congress. And they have an action pack which you can request, and I will be posting, copying and pasting in the link to the action pack for Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. Also, another action that took place that we probably didn't hear very much about if we were looking at the mainstream press. While the governments of Mexico, the United States, and Canada have been working really hard to try to save NAFTA. Thousands of Mexicans got out in the streets to scrap NAFTA. So that was something that happened last week and that we never really heard about very much unless you were looking on the Trade Justice group page, but not in the mainstream. So also this week on the 22nd, there is going to be a collaborative webinar. This webinar is in collaboration with Alianza Americas, Labor Council for Latin American Advancement, and the Sierra Club. And the focus of this webinar is the future of NAFTA. What does it mean for working people, migration, and the planet? And there is a blurb about it on this slide, but I think that you ought to sign up. There is a link to sign up, and you can get on the webinar. It's in the afternoon. It is 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and so it's at noon on Tuesday. That is the 22nd. So hope you can make that webinar. And also, if you didn't catch it, there was a live streamed event at Netroots Nation. It was a trade panel with Lori Wallach and Keith Ellison, and let's see, who were the people that were on this council? They were Mashed Zahid with Credo, Our Revolution's Erica Andiola, and Sierra Club's Ben Beachy. And this was a live-streamed event, and you can I also have the link for that. It's a really good panel, and I think you ought to catch it if you can. It'll get you all worked up and wanting to do something. Also wanted to mention we have an exciting new webinar next month with our September 24th Sunday webinar is going to be titled Fair Trade Congress 2018, Holding Free Traders Accountable. Our special guest will be Tim Canova, founder of Progress for All, and Debbie Wasserman-Schultz, challenger. Also Victor Tiffany, the co-founder of Revolt Against Plutocracy and the founder of Bernie or Bust. And that we talked Andrea Miller into being our moderator for that webinar. So we really hope you'll be able to make it. That's going to be a very exciting event. And I think that's going to be a theme from now on, like we did with the TPP. We can't just let this NAFTA just go as the way it is now. We've got to make it either a better agreement or absolutely replace it. So on that call, we are going to also do something that we used to do. We are going to go back and do some of our trade justice field reports, and the special guests for that are going to be the attendees, and that means you. So we're going to be looking for special reports on all of your actions in the field, whether you did a creative action, whether you did an office visit or a town hall. And if you could send me a picture and just a few words to describe your event, we will open the mic for you on the September 24th webinar, and you can tell us a little bit about it. So you can send it to me at harriet@tradejustice.net, and I will be happy to put it up on our presentation. I wanted to remind you that you can access all of our YouTube videos at tradejustice.net/webinar vids, and I'm sure you all know that Carrie Marks, our techno wizard, is the one that actually puts all these together. She mixes the sound and the visuals and makes these beautiful presentations. So we'll have this particular one I'll be sending out to my trade justice list, and I will also be posting it onto our Facebook group. And we wanted to thank Carrie for putting those together. You can support Trade Justice Alliance. You can still volunteer. We're always looking for new people to work with us. We have planning calls every Tuesday evening, and they are at 8 Eastern, 5 Pacific time, and the number that you dial is the same as the number you dialed in tonight. So we're looking forward to having new people join us. You can help us figure out new ideas for topics for the webinars, speakers, and all kinds of things like that. So you can also donate to us if you're so inclined at tradejustice.net/give. TJA Donate. And that is going to be it for tonight. Thank you very much. We did go a little long. We had a couple of technical issues, but we really appreciate all the wonderful speakers, and we appreciate your joining us tonight. So thank you very much. Stay on at the end if you like.